starting late because of this, but there we go, Mark. We're having a couple of tech issues, but I suppose that these things happen. Welcome to Uplink 11, and this is the excitement of doing things live. How are you doing today?
I'm good. Working in the space business, 3 minutes late is not late at all. You're fully fully excused. 3 years late, I think we might lose a few people, but we're good.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I got to say, it's an incredibly appropriate background that you have selected, and I've got to say that it's a pleasure to be having this conversation, not just because it's stimulating, but also because it's a bit of a Space Rocks family reunion of sorts, because our guests today have both attended Space Rocks events and taken the stage and done wonderful things with us. But before I spend the rest of the hour singing their praises, I wanted to say that I got to ask the most basic question, because of course it's a bit of a loaded title for Uplink 11. It's rewriting the space race. So I'm going to ask you a bit of a big question here. What is the space race?
Well, I mean, it's a mixture between the technology needed to get into space and people competing. Of course, a lot of this comes out of the post Second World War era. As we know, German scientists went west and they went east, and the new superpowers, Soviet Union, United States, started competing to see who could be the first to put a human in space. And of course, we know full well that the Soviet Union won that race, but later on, the race then became to the moon, and it developed differently in that case. And everybody knows the outcome of Apollo. But of course, it's not just a technical race, it was a political race, and it had to do with post Second World War supremacy on the world stage, global superpowers. But it's been cast in many different ways over the years. I mean, Europe was not deeply involved in that race to begin with, but we're involved in different kinds of races, if race is the right word. There's all sorts of things to do with how do you preserve space as an environment to work in. You know, there's kind of a race to save low Earth orbit from all the debris which is up there. There's a race in certain circles to commercialize space. So I think it's, you know, it's a one size fits all term. It came from the 1950s, if not before. But hopefully today we'll hear some strands of that original race, which tend to be a bit forgotten over time. And both of our guests this afternoon are experts in exactly that topic.
Yeah, indeed. Well, I got to say that, I, like a lot of people, I grew up with a certain narrative. And not necessarily, through any conspiracy, but simply because, the historical stories that are told are frequently the least complicated ones. And I guess that's where the problem is, because they don't necessarily invite dissection or revision, which is kind of necessary, or for the nuance and all the stories that are also worth kind of addressing. And that's why I'm so excited to be inviting Sue Nelson, and I'm just going to admit her now, from the waiting room, just to talk about, one of those stories, which I think is so important and an incredibly stimulating one as well. All right, Sue, how are you doing? Oh, we're going to try that again.
Yeah, this time with audio, this time with brio.
There we go. Yeah, I was just eating. So yeah, fine, thanks.
Lovely to have you aboard, and I should say welcome back, even though, well, these are strange times and strange circumstances. But thank you so much for joining.
You're lucky I'm dressed, quite frankly.
I don't know. They look like good pajamas to me. I mean,
Yeah, I made an effort. The first shower I've had in 3 days, I think. So.
Yeah.
Lovely. Fragrant.
Well, indeed. Well, I've got to say, well, first things first. I guess Mark and I are we're getting pretty good at the Zoom backgrounds right now, but you have a real one, an incredibly fascinating looking bookshelf that I love to peruse. But of among many entries, there's one in particular that we want to talk about, and that of course is Wally Funk's Race for Space. What a phenomenal story, phenomenal book, and I've got to ask you, where did the story begin? And this is a bit loaded, and I was saying to Mark, it's a slightly loaded title. but I'm going to start with this now. Can you answer me this? Is everything that I need to know about the space race contained in this book?
Yeah. Brilliant book though it is, the answer to that question is no.
Yes,
So,
indeed.
and what's missing is the Mercury 13 women. They weren't called the Mercury 13 women then, of course, but they were basically women who, like the Mercury 7 men, who were our first, astronauts for human spaceflight for American astronauts. They wanted to do the same, so they took the same tests as the men in the early 60s. So it's a huge, I mean, that's where are we now, 60 years ago, and it still surprises me that people haven't heard about them or know about them. And possibly that's because, well, maybe, the usual thing is history is only written by those who win the wars, sort of thing. And in this case, it was a war in a way, because it was a space race. It was a political war and a race between America and Russia. So maybe that's why the women's story just sort of gradually vanished from trace, and then it kept coming back a little bit. And yeah, my aim was to make sure that everybody knew about it, because not everything is in the history books. And I think particularly if you're a woman, and I was obsessed with space as a kid, still am. I was obsessed with science fiction, still am. In fact, I meant to get Battlestar Galactica as my background, so I'm really sorry I didn't get a chance to do that. You really need to see your own. I mean, people, of color say the same as well. If you see that someone like you is there, it really acts as a tremendous boost to sort of morale and confidence, and also makes you realize the truth of history. Our history books is that they don't always include everything. I mean, for instance, there were actually Native Americans in NASA and the space race, not just women of color, and not just, they were all white, the Mercury 13, but not all these female pilots that tried to become astronauts such a long time ago. And so when you find that out, you realize actually it wasn't all men doing it. It wasn't there. Everyone was in it, but you people looking like you and me and what have you. And yeah, I think particularly for young people, that's what amazed me when Wally was over in the UK last year, was the response she got from kids and every age, and old people coming at, is when they realized that women had wanted to be astronauts. They didn't just want to stay at home in the early 60s and iron shirts. It makes people go, whoa, yeah. And it makes you realize that you don't feel abnormal if at that time you liked science or space or wanted to have a career doing what the supposedly men's careers were, which being a pilot was very much considered at the time.
Indeed.
So,
please go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, no, I'm just curious because the Soviets worked this out. After all, I mean, it didn't take them very long to fly a woman, Valentina Tereshkova. So what was the sociological difference if it was not? I mean, because we know that there were all sorts of excuses made about physiological differences, which is, as in your book, the tests showed that the women were perfectly capable of withstanding the physical stresses. But in your writing and your research, did you find a reason why? I mean, did the Soviets purely do it as a stunt and the Americans didn't want to follow that? I mean, I don't think Valentina Tereshkova would say that.
No, well, I think it's a sort of mix of both, to be honest, because obviously it was a political belief in terms of communism, and that men and women are supposed to be equal, and therefore why shouldn't a woman be doing it? And so it's very much a statement of in terms of a political belief. But also you cannot help but think it's also, there was a slight one-upmanship stunt against it, because they knew that the Americans were training women. They knew. So, that helped. Plus, as soon as Valentina Tereshkova went up, they didn't put another woman up for nearly 20 years. It was almost like saying, well, we've done it now. We don't need to do it again. And when they did do it, once again, it was because they'd heard that America was about to put its first woman into space on the shuttle. And so they rushed out quickly. They got another one so that they could go, "Ah." So
but
literally, they got
what's
another one. And they're still, you know, I mean, Valentina Tereshkova was over in London a couple of years ago for the Cosmonaut, the opening of the Cosmonauts exhibition at the Science Museum. And she was quite feisty, because I did ask her a question about, you know, why have the Soviets been so poor effectively in terms of their getting women? It's like they do it and then they've ticked a box. And she basically agreed and said, you know, they've got to pull the finger out effectively and do it. So yeah, there's definitely a political aspect. Right. And I'm sure if America were to do the same now, Russia would suddenly find right. something. Well, they haven't got the money so much nowadays, but you know, there's a little bit of it.
But I think, you know, what's fascinating about this, and this is what, you know, today's talk is about, is the way that the history of space has been recast. Because, of course, you know, my kids growing up, and if they haven't done their homework, they'll think, you know, it's always been an American thing. They'll forget that America was actually, you know, well behind the game at the beginning. Not only was Tereshkova the first woman, but Gagarin the first man, and the first spacewalk from Leonov, and all these sorts of things. And what surprises me in retrospect is that, you know, and I mean this in the most polite way, Americans are pretty good at PR stunts as well. So why weren't they doing these things, right? You know, it just seems like, if nothing else, the Barnum and Bailey sort of school of, let's just do it for the show of it. And so I'm still interested in the deeper sociological differences that somebody at NASA said, no, we're not doing any stunts actually, and the politics maybe didn't. I don't know. I'm just curious as to how that really played out.
Yeah, well, it's I just don't think it entered at the time. I think they were so focused on getting there first, getting to the moon first. The sort of fact that women were interested and were doing the tests as a sort of side issue, because it wasn't funded by NASA. It was an independently funded program by a man called Dr. Randolph Lovelace, Randy Lovelace, best name ever, and in New Mexico. So the tests were done at the same Lovelace clinic that the Mercury 7 men had done. And it doesn't exist now, although there is a great big, I went to it actually with Wally Funk to see what remained. There is a big, his family, there are still Lovelace medical buildings all over Albuquerque, which is lovely to see, and you can still sort of see where it used to be. But I think the fact that it was being done as a side issue, yes, it involved Randolph Lovelace, was also head of NASA's life sciences. So there was a connection, because he devised those tests for the NASA astronauts and then decided to also try women to see if they could pass too. Sociologically, you know, if you look at the history, I'm sure you know that, not because you were there, but, you know.
Thank you.
Yeah, I better get that in. You know, the most women at that time didn't even have a career. If you did have a career, it was quite a traditional type career. It was teaching, nurse, it was secretary. And it was assumed that as soon as you got married, you'd give up your job. So there were lots of things actually that they had to overcome at the time. Was not just the attitude at the time towards women, because let's face it, all those women who took the tests to be pilots in the early 60s and 50s and what have you, and a lot of them came from, you know, went through the WASP program during World War II as well, a few of the older ones. That was unusual in itself, so they were even unusual for their time. But to go against that society's expectations is a lot. But it's interesting what you say also about, you know, people not realizing that Russia's involved. It's the same with Europe as well, I think, is that a lot of people forget that there are European astronauts. And what I've found nice about the feedback is that Americans who have read it are always quite gobsmacked at the history of women in space that's away from just shuttle astronauts. That it actually covers what's gone on this side of the Atlantic as well. So that's, you know, that's sort of a win-win as far as I'm concerned, because we did go to Wally and I did go to the European Space Agency, and I put a chapter of that in the book, where we met Samantha Cristoforetti and went also to the headquarters and met Jan Werner and what have you. And he was a big fan, because he'd used the story of the Mercury 13 in his interview to get the job. So he was waiting there like a fanboy. You know, he had his book ready for her, not my another book about Mercury 13, to sort of sign it really quickly. He was really excited. So it was quite funny to watch. And actually, on the way out of that building, we bumped into Claudia. I can never quite pronounce her name.
Claudia
Enure, yes. And I never have to say it. I only ever write it, so that's why I'm never quite sure of the pronunciation. And that was amazing to me, you know, the first French woman to go into space, which again, I'm sure that even though loads of people in America and are real space fans, and I love that about America, that people get so into it. These are names that are not necessarily familiar to them at all in terms of what's going on. So it's still a learning curve, I suppose.
Right. Indeed, an important learning curve, and well, I'm here to help us surmount that. Dallas, can I check? Are you receiving?
I am receiving you. God, I'm so sick of online Zooms and Google blah, and other things.
I have a suggestion for you, though, Dallas. If you did use a virtual background, it would trim your hair for you automatically.
No, are you kidding? This is my awesome lockdown hair. I'm really enjoying having my big hair.
You're actually hanging upside down, right? You've turned the screen. You're actually upside down, and
you're
simulating zero G.
You should try the lockdown.
Does it make it grow? I'm not sure it works that way. Thank you.
Sorry I'm late. I've just caught the end of Sue talking brilliantly. So I apologize for being late. What did I miss?
Nothing at all, Dallas. Uplink is a live program. It seems that a few unforeseen hurdles manifest themselves, which kind of keeps things exciting.
Actually, it's quite good. It's I always, talking to astronauts, one of the things, as Sue will tell you, and Mark, one of the things about astronauts is it's always a good astronaut is how they behave in a crisis. A test of an astronaut is what happens when things go wrong. I would be a terrible astronaut, as I've just demonstrated, because the merest Zoom link that goes wrong and I fall apart. So God knows what I'd be like,
I must admit, lockdowns made me realise as well that I've always wanted to be an astronaut ever since I was a kid. And lockdown has made me realise that I might not be as temperamentally suited for it. Because I've gone a little bit mad.
Yeah.
And I've alternated between, painting a massive rocket thing on my patio to staying in bed for 24 hours just doing online Scrabble. So and dribbling, and like I want to get out.
Classy.
So I realized, God, if I was up in a space station like that, woo.
Yeah, I've gone a bit stir crazy. I've gone commando for the entire lockdown.
What is it with certain men? They have to share their underwear.
I don't know. It's just panned out that way. Sue's been doing beautiful.
Sorry, is that another pun? It's just panned out that way. I'm
right. Yeah.
I was saying before you came on, actually, Dallas. I was saying that basically this is the first time I've washed in 3 days.
No, you look great.
So I thought I'd make a bit. I wasn't joking when I tweeted that I'd gone a bit feral. I really had.
Good. Well, anyway, we've all gone a bit feral.
I get the feeling this might be a 4-hour uplink this afternoon.
Oh, okay.
Going for the record.
Just to catch up, I'm very interested in your response as well, Dallas. And it's just to bring a bit of my personal biography. And for part of my childhood, I grew up in Washington, D.C. And anyone who's been around there knows that the best possible place to visit there is not the White House, but the Air and Space Museum.
Oh, God, yes.
And this was years and years before Udvar Hazy opened up toward Dulles, which, of course, is an astonishing playground. But it was around that time that I was exposed to a movie based on this book, which, for a long time, a phenomenal book, phenomenal movie. But I'd asked Sue, and I think you might know the answer that she came back with was, does it contain everything we need to know about the space race? And I've got a strong suspicion that telepathically I know how you're going to respond.
Yeah, no, it doesn't at all. It's a very small bit, it's a particular story and it's a great story. But as as Sue will tell you and everyone will tell you, it's, the story of space travel is much broader than just that. It encompasses so much. I mean, my particular interest in space isn't just the right stuffy type stuff, or isn't just sort of the facts and figures about space, but much wider context, the culture, the history, the politics. Long before we'd even gone into space, our dreams of going into space, I find fascinating. The science, the engineering, the art of the time, all of that I find interesting. And there are so many other stories that don't really get told. And the right stuff, it's been brilliant, but it's sort of become lore. And it's slightly overshadowed many of the other stories, which are equally wonderful, equally brilliant, and lesser known. I suppose what I was trying to do, the last sort of few years, when I wrote Ad Astra, was to try and collect some of those stories and actually think about the stories of space travel a little bit differently from an anthropological point of view, as much as from an engineering or scientific point of view and a historical point of view. Actually, I don't know if you got to see the wonderful moon exhibition that was at the Royal Museum in Greenwich. And to me, that was much more what I'm interested in when I think about space. From William Blake through to the Jacobean space program, through some of the artists who dreamt of going into space, the invention of the telescope, and all those kinds of stories. One of the stories that it was an object that they had there, and they had some incredible objects and incredible works of art, but there was a papier-mâché space helmet that some kid in Birmingham in the 1970s had made for a Blue Peter competition or something, and it was really badly made, but it was beautiful. It was the most extraordinary object. And it said so much about us as humans and about our desires and our wishes to go to space and to be explorers and to think what that's about. And it's objects like that and those kinds of stories, those sort of social stories, which I find equally as exciting as as the right stuff. I mean, I love the right stuff. It's fun and it's all kind of light this candle and all that kind of stuff. It's all good stuff. But
I agree, because in the right stuff, the focus is on those 7 men.
Yeah.
And the women are just the wives. And I agree with you. I like the social aspect. I like the history. I like knowing what's going on around it as well. And I agree with you. I thought that exhibition was just, I spent so long wouldn't come out, basically. And I like the cosmonauts one as well for the same reason, is that you got a history of how the Soviets were crazy about all these beautiful tea sets with Sputnik on them and things like that, and stamps. I mean, I collect lots of little stamps, space stamps, and loads of them are from that era. And it tells us what, I suppose, in the same way as the coronaviruses will define a generation today. I think that period of time defined society, and it was looking outward. It was looking in terms of exploration, to boldly go, well, dare I say it, but it was positive. And that's what I like about it.
There was a really, in fact, the very first object they had in that exhibition, when you walked through the door to start with, it was a beautiful William Blake etching that he'd done, very, very small. But it was just it was a picture of just a ladder and this boy climbing the ladder, and it just towards the moon. So they'd built a ladder to the moon in this etching, and it was just, I want. And that's what, that's what the kind of, I think the joy of exploring the history of this subject is about. It's about our desire to explore and to travel, much broader than the kind of narrow focus. I'm always surprised actually by quite a lot of space, not you guys, but some space experts who sort of fixate on the sort of facts. I'm going to tell you facts about space. And I'm like, no, it's so much richer than that. It's so much more interesting than that. I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
So
I can't remember facts anyway like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember anything, which is why I write things down. It should not be an exercise in the retention of space facts. That does not prove anything. That's the.
Let me pick up on one thing that you said there, because of course the right stuff has another protagonist in it, which is Chuck Yeager, played by Sam Shepard. And he has a very different take on the whole thing. I mean, he's kind of clear that this is being played as a piece of PR, as a piece of theatre, and he wants no part of it at the time. So I'm curious, inverting that, given that it's now become sort of legend, that this is the quintessential expression of the American spirit, blah blah blah, right? What was the Russian take on it? What was the point for Russia? Was it simply to prove that collectivism was the way of taking humankind to the next level? Was it purely showing off against the Americans? I mean, you've done quite a lot of reading and research on this, Dallas.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of everything. I mean, as you say, so much of the Right Stuff story is wound up by American culture. I always think of, those sort of late 50s, early 60s. If you think about the hero dogs of each culture, you had Lassie, was the American hero dog, which was this free dog that would roam around, and Laika was this sort of part of the Soviet collectivism, as you say. But I think so much part of that Soviet thing was partly the collectivism, as you say, but it's also wrapped up in Soviet philosophy and Russian culture generally. I mean, if you look at the propaganda art around the space race at that time, it's so different to the American story. It is all about, it's almost like a transhumanism, that sort of transhumanism that filters through Russian philosophy and Russian literature. This notion of the human spirit being part of the stars through technology and through science is really, really evident there, which was less in the American story, which is all very much about the individual hero. So think people like sort of Chuck Yeager and Gus Grisham and Shepard and all these people, less about the hero. Although I suppose Gagarin was very much a hero, but he was very much a hero of the state as well. I mean, they chose Gagarin partly because he was a farmer. He was the son of a farmer. I mean, so that's why he was chosen rather than the son of a general, for example. They liked that. It was it's wrapped up in the what? Sorry.
And Tereshkova was a textile worker. So yes, it does. It all fits in very nicely there, doesn't it?
But even the sort of the art surrounding it as well. I mean, I've got this book here, Galina Balashkova. She was she's a real forgotten hero of mine in the story of space travel, who no one really talks about. She did all the internal drawings, the artwork of the designs for Soyuz and the Mir space station, and even the kind of color schemes, the sort of color palettes that she chose are so sort of Russian and so different to the Americans. I mean, if you look at the sort of International Space Station, the sort of Russian segment still looks very different to the rest of the in these sorts of kind of olive greens and drab colors. But I love all this stuff. Look at these beautiful pictures. So this is all sort of dates in the 19th.
Yeah, that looks like a teeth made.
Yeah.
1960s.
But it's quite sort of Wes Anderson as well, in the kind of color palette that's sort of really kind of satisfying. But I love that idea of there's that picture of the sort of astronaut floating above the Moscow skyline with the stars behind, saying, "I see no God." There's the fact that at a launch at Baikonur, you still have the kind of Russian priest who comes up wearing the robes and blesses everyone with holy water. It's so wrapped up in the traditions and sort of philosophy of Russian culture.
I'm curious, did that happen during the Soviet period, or has that actually come back in the Baikonur period?
I have no idea.
There was a contradiction there. There's no God, and then there's a priest turning up.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know. I mean, there's obviously loads of other traditions that you know about. Someone told me, I don't know if this is true. Apparently, the guy whose job it was, who was the sort of closeout guy, whose job it was to shut the hatch on the Soyuz, it's still the same guy who did Gagarin. Apparently, I can't believe that's true, but someone told me that the other day. Saying, "Oh no, it's still the same guy." But anyway.
Maybe it's like an executioner. Maybe it's been handed down to his son, right?
Maybe.
I think for me, a pure representation of how male and macho the whole thing is the Russian tradition of the astronauts pissing on the side of a wheel or whatever it is, or is that the Americans? I can't remember.
No, it's the Russians. You're right.
I thought so. I just sort of think, are you going to get a woman astronaut taking off her suit in order to do that?
They do.
I just find it. Oh, yeah.
I spoke to one of them, and they take. No, well, they do it because it was what Gagarin did. So in the same way that planting a tree and everything else and signing a door. But I spoke to one.
I mean, I just feel that's just ludicrous. It's a bit like when you're a kid and your mum says, "And if he put your hand in the fire, would you do it?" You know?
But it says a lot about us as we're superstitious creatures. We're creatures of habit. I mean, the Americans do it as well. The Americans always had sort of steak and eggs before they flew, and they have their traditions, whatever.
That's okay.
But I spoke to one female astronaut who flew, and they apparently they take a little pea pot and pour it over the tire.
I love those stories, and I think Dallas and Sue, you both hit on things that are so wonderful about this history. It reminds me of something that Alan Stern of the New Horizons mission said, that they actually had a wood panel installed in the all plastic and metal interior of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, so they would have a bit of wood to touch, just whenever.
Yeah.
And so that's what's so important, and as a tip of the hat to another exhibit that absolutely blew my mind. It was the cosmonauts exhibit at the Science Museum here in London, which, for the same reason, it didn't just broaden the narrative and our understanding of where the Soviet space program was coming from, which is very much, it was based on an aspiration that they seemed to have for decades before they launched, Sputnik. It's not just about painting a more complete picture, though. It's also about inspiring the right people, in future generations. It's an issue of representation, fairness, and also making sure that that everyone feels drawn into this tremendous story, not just as future engineers or astronauts, but as people who are intrigued by the exploration of space.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. The cosmonauts exhibition was fantastic. It was just beautiful. Well, my favorite tradition is, I think it still happens. All the cosmonauts, they leave some crackers for the next crew who come up. There's a great story. I don't know if you know the story of Salyut 7, the Salyut 7 spacecraft. Do you know about that story?
The Apollo 13 of the
it was the Apollo, yeah, the Apollo 13. But I like that bit when the astronauts kind of arrived at the dead space station. And for those who don't know, Salyut 7 was a sort of precursor to the Mir space station, and it lost power in orbit, and they weren't sure whether or not to bring it down or to keep it going. It was just before Mir was launched. They decided to they sent 2 astronauts up, kind of wearing furry hats and big coats, which is what I like. They pulled one of the seats out the Soyuz, so they had 2 seats. The other seat was full of like kids. And these 2 guys wearing furry hats arrived at the Salyut space station. They didn't know whether the air was breathable, and they went in, and it was frosty inside and incredibly dangerous. But the crackers were there on the table that had been left by the previous crew, so they could still break bread together. They could still sort of commune, and they had this passing on of this tradition, which I think, I don't know, we are traditional people. We have strange things, touching wood and peeing against tires, and I don't know. I think there's something quite charming. Maybe not the peeing.
Exactly. I just think you have to be really careful, because there are traditions which are lovely, and we all do them, whether it's celebrating people we've loved or lost in a certain way and doing a certain thing. But then often within women's history, tradition is often the word given for the status quo and for not allowing women rights, because it's not traditional. It's tradition that only men do this job. It's tradition that and so for me, that word is a double-edged sword, because so often it means loss, and it means lost opportunities for women in the name of tradition.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if we could expand a little bit on that, Sue, because I think it's just such an important thread in all of this conversation. Where did the story begin for you in retracing and celebrating the history of Wally Funk? How did that story begin, and how well did you get to know her through the whole process of telling that remarkable story?
Well, it began in New York, actually. I was living in New York for a year and freelancing as a journalist. And I came across literally 2 lines in a newspaper. I suspect it was the New York Times, because that was the only paper I got. And it just referred to the Mercury 13. And just literally a line saying, and the women who never got to go, who passed the astronaut test. And I was probably having coffee and what? I couldn't believe it. And so it's been like a 20-year-old pilgrimage for me, because from that day on, I became determined to find out more about the women. I came back to London and I sold it as through an independent production company as a Radio 4 documentary on the Mercury 13 called Right Stuff, Wrong Sets. And that was literally made about 6 months after I had seen the thing in the newspaper. And so for that was when I first met Wally. So I first met Wally in 1997. And I traced down as many of the women who were alive, because some of them had even died by then. I met Irene Leviton in Arizona. Irene was one of the 13 women that passed. She was the first female crop duster in the United States. I just love that. And, you know, she took me to her local airport where she worked. And a lot of these women used to test airplanes for particularly from the end of the war onwards. And so they all had their own different, it's like Dallas is saying, what we both have in common is that we like stories. And I wanted to know the stories of all of them. I met Jerry Truehill, who was also one of she only died, I think, about a year ago. She was a member of the Mercury 13. Even though her husband was a pilot, he didn't like, so he lived with a woman who was a pilot. He knew what the job involved. It still obviously irked him that she would have an opportunity to potentially be an astronaut, because when it came to doing the tests, he told her, either you go off and, you know, do the tests, so you're not coming back, you know, this cis, marriage is over. And she came back from the plane, you know, she came back from having done the tests to be met with divorce papers. So, I mean, there's that aspect of loss as well, because a lot of the women, in order to actually take those tests, had to actually give up their jobs because they wouldn't give them the time free to actually take the tests. So I met 4 of them when I was there. The 4th one I met there was Sarah Ratley, who had been a maths graduate. Also, they were all incredible pilots. They were all, a lot of them were really, really bright as well. And I met Wally too. So I met 4 of them, and then kept in touch with Wally throughout for 20 years. But just, you know, just little cards here and there. I did the odd piece and came back. And then it was thanks to BBC World Service, actually, about 4 years ago. I have been trying to sell, well, even in the 90s, I tried to sell a book on the Mercury 13, and I was told in no uncertain terms by several publishers that no one is interested in reading about women and their history. So I sort of gave up on that, but hadn't given up, and I'm quite tenacious. So, you know, 20 years of hanging on there. And I'd been trying to sell a program to Radio 4 on the history of women in space, probably for about 3 years. And they kept saying, yeah. And again, it was that, I get so cross sometimes with this sort of like, who will this appeal to? And then finally the world, you know, I'm a great believer, a producer once told me, is if you have ideas rejected, and you think they're good, you retitle, resell it. You know, you just put it in a new paper bag. And so basically I did that. I retitled and I resold it to BBC World Service Radio. And they jumped at it. And it was the commissioning editor said, I'd suggested Sarah Cruddas, who's a space broadcaster. I'm really knowledgeable about current human spaceflight, and I suggested her as a presenter. And the commissioning editor said, no, I know who to have. And I actually thought he meant me, because I was a broadcaster. And so I got all fake modest and was like, I'm so sorry, you know, I really want to produce this. And he went, not you. He went, Wally Funk, Wally Funk. I want Wally Funk. And I was really quite shocked, because, you know, if you've ever seen her talk or met her, she's uncontrollable, you know. I just thought I couldn't produce her. She's too free-spirited. She's like a free-range hen. Even when we did her talks, half the time I was trying to rein her in and say, Wally, come back on stage, you know, come back. She was wandering here everywhere. And he said, and it was lovely, and I mentioned this in the introduction, I said, why Wally? And he said, because every time you say her name, you smile. And so that was what kick-started everything off again. So I was sort of relearning it for a second time after having done the documentary 20 years ago, but this time on a more personal level. So Wally and I did spend a couple of years on and off together, going on trips, doing the radio reports, because we then did another World Service, liked the program so much and it won an award that they commissioned another program. And so I've got to know her pretty well now, so much so probably that's why a lot of the book is a little bit, it's a bit of bickering between us as well, because we do clash at times, because she's a very strong-willed woman. Naturally, she couldn't have got to where she was until, you know, if she hadn't been. So yeah, and I spoke to her a few days ago actually to check how she was in lockdown. And I think this says it all. She went, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm on my own. I'm fine. She said, I've been riding my tractor. I've been out by the lake and I've been flying. I'm absolutely fine. And I just, okay, fine. Yeah. And it was almost like she was telling me off for, you know, for just asking how she was. So yeah. So she feels like my favorite old, oh, she'd hate me saying old, sorry. My favorite aunt, let's put it that way, one that you love dearly, that you love being with, can drive you up the wall sometimes, but you just can't help but admire her for her ambition and her role in history, and the fact that she's not given up and still wants to go into space with Virgin Galactic. So I know that's quite a long answer to your question, but it's really hard to, because it has been 20 years of sort of 20 years of 20 years of my life. So
it's a great answer, and you know, I guess it's just so important, you know, to share these stories, because of course, well, we have people from joining all over the world today, which is a really lovely thing, you know, and you know, ages kind of range. You know, there's one question which I think is absolutely brilliant that's come from Amanda on behalf of Annabelle. Do you think there'll ever be an all-female crew on the space station? Which I think is a wonderful question.
I thought there already had been an all-female crew on the space station. Wasn't there a period of time when there were just several women up there?
There have been two simultaneously, I think, but I think that's the most. Yeah, I don't think there's been more than two at any given time.
Okay, right, okay. Maybe I just ignore the men and just focus on, no, there are two women, that's it.
But it's an important question, and you know, the subject of sci-fi comes up frequently in these sorts of discussions, because I guess so much of it perhaps is aspirational. You know, I mean, and you know, Sue, I know you in particular, you know, are not unfamiliar with Gene Roddenberry's work. You know, and so much about our visions of the future, you know, are they're diverse. There is fair representation, and just like some ideals, and I suppose there is something, and just a question for the group. Is there something about space exploration that we feel really is kind of just it's the best expression of the human endeavor in so many ways, and so we expect it to be fair, but it is riven with problems. The way that we tell these stories, so much of the anniversaries that we celebrate often exclude, and like you say, traditions are problematic. So it's the job of, I guess, a new generation of space historians to rebalance those errors. Is that an important role from your perspective?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, first part of your question, it is such a wonderful expression of what it is to be human. So yes, I mean, space does, to quote Gene Roddenberry, it is the great frontier, the final frontier. It's the biggest frontier. It is natural for us to want to explore it. But you're absolutely right. We do need different ways of telling stories. Having people like Sue telling stories, you know, her book, all that kind of stuff filters through. And now, for example, the last group of NASA astronauts was 50-50. I couldn't sort of imagine it being anything other than that now. Yeah. We do seem to have had a real shift in the way that we talk about it. So maybe it's just because I'm involved in it. I don't know about people in the sort of wider world, but I certainly notice a shift. I mean, even things like Apollo, for example. You know, Apollo, we forget at the time of the civil rights movement that was going on in America when Apollo was going on. And you know, those stories need to be told as well. You know, the famous Whitey on the Moon song, the fact that, you know, America was involved in Vietnam at the time. All these stories of inequality and injustice that were happening have in the past tend to have been whitewashed by the literally whitewashed by the Apollo story. And we do need to retell it differently. That's not to take away from the wonders and the majesty of something like Apollo and what was behind it. But we need better storytellers. We need different narratives, and we certainly need to be more inclusive when we tell those stories.
Are we actually in danger of repeating the mistake? I mean, not we, but as society, you know, the current new race for space is commercially driven, and is driven by capitalism. But it also, you know, and I won't make any friends by saying this, I mean, there's an awful lot of toxic masculinity wrapped around the current drive for colonizing Mars and putting boot prints on places. And you know, we've all dealt with them online, I'm sure. We've all said the wrong thing to the wrong person on Twitter or other places and had the fanboys, you know, dump on you from a great height. Is there a danger that it's viewed now through an even more extreme lens, perhaps, because of the way that world politics is changing underneath us? I mean, it's not as if we've all come together in the last 30 years. The fall of the Cold War didn't bring an end to politics, right?
No, it is still very political. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know, Sue, what do you think? I'm going to hand that one over to Sue.
Sorry, I wasn't totally listening then.
I know.
Thank you.
Really sorry.
I was listening to you, Mark.
I'm sorry. I sort of was half listening.
Actually, you're absolutely okay. Well, the shift has focused, you know, from big world politics to suddenly, you know, internet billionaires. And I think part of what you are alluding to, Mark, is the fact that all those people that you're talking to, Musk and Bezos and Branson, all grew up in the Apollo era, and they were all influenced by those particular narratives at the time. So people like Walt Disney and Willie Ley and Werner von Braun, who were the big showboating PR people of the time, you know, that sort of carried through into their world, I suppose. But yeah, it's a shame that it is become a sort of very male dominated, you know, a new space race, a sort of a willy waving, how much money have you got kind of space race.
Well, it is almost boys with their toys, and it's millionaire boys with their toys, and it's sad that it is so male. It's bloke. I think the word is blokey, because I've met a number of women who have bought tickets to be on commercial space flights, not just Wally, but others as well. I met the Anusha Ansari, who's the Iranian American, who was effectively the first space tourist in the States, woman who paid to go on board, and she's involved in the Ansari X Prize and what have you. So there are women involved in this at the very highest level. And obviously the first woman in terms of getting technically into space with Virgin Galactic was Beth Moses, who's their astronaut trainer.
That's my favorite photo ever, is that one of Beth Moses.
Oh yeah, when
isn't it
she's
great?
her expression. And I think I mean, I sort of am in two minds, because particularly with SpaceX, because I love what they're all doing. I like the fact that, you know, this is a new era, and I do love it. But then I'm in two minds, because when he sent the red car up,
I was going to ask.
Part of me was like, sort of, oh wow, that's cool. And then another part of me was like, what? A car? Oh, come on. So yeah, it's difficult, because it did get people's attention, but again, it's quite blokey. And similarly with the SpaceX, when they did those two magnificent landings, the dual landings of the rocket stages that came back down in unison for the first time, I was screaming with the rest of them. That was just utterly brilliant. Whenever they went back to mission control and the SpaceX team, it was just all blokes, and to me it just looked like the Apollo era of blokes. But they had a woman. They had one of their few women engineers was hosting it, whose name escapes me. She's brilliant. But I just felt, oh God, I almost feel like it's a token thing again. It's like, oh, we know we better put a woman on there hosting it so that they can see. But so yeah, I'm in two minds. I do think there is a touch of blokiness about it, but I'm sort of glad they're there. I do think it's about inequality, because if you look at how Jeff Bezos makes his money and how little people who work at Amazon are paid, then there's a huge issue here. His ambitions are at the expense of thousands of workers. So yeah, there are lots of things to unpick about it. Now, I just want to explain the reason why I wasn't quite listening, only half listening. My husband always says I can never quite multitask because, you know, I think I can and I can't. Is because I texted my son to say, bring up this, because, and this is an exclusive. You're getting this before I put it. I've opened an account with Lego and I'm going to launch it either tomorrow or the next day to try and get a Lego Mercury 13 minifigure set out to celebrate the contribution of women. And this is what I was asking to get. This is the Wally Funk one, and it replicates the picture that's sort of used on this book of her with, you can't see actually, it's the hardback that had the picture of the plane, a T-33 fighter jet with her when she was at Fort Sill. So yeah, so I've actually got three little figures. I've got Dr. Randy Lovelace and his tilt table with one of the women on there, and also Jerry Cobb by a Mercury 7 capsule. So yes, this is an exclusive. This is the project, is to try and get the Mercury 13 as a minifigure Lego set, in the same way that you had the women of NASA. Yeah, isn't that great? I mean, that's not Joe, but that's such a great picture.
One of my favorites.
That's a great picture. So yeah, so it's effectively, yes, it's very similar to that. So yeah.
Annoyingly, I've left this in direct sunlight and it's really faded, which is a real shame.
You should frame it.
Yeah, it's annoying, all the colors sort of drained from it. I've just sort of noticed that. Damn it. Never mind.
Well, I've got to say, Sue, that is a huge exclusive, and of course, you know, just like what better conduit and way to express, you know, just like these wonderful histories than through the universal medium of Lego.
Exactly. I think. So once it goes up, I'll tweet about it. Once it goes up, everyone has to vote, and you have to get so many thousand votes in order to then go through the stage until eventually, fingers crossed, it gets to the stage where Lego will make a set, like the way they've honoured Margaret Hamilton and all the other women of NASA and Nancy Roman and things like that. So yeah, I would love that.
Well, so we would love to get the full details, and of course post on spacerocksofficial.com, because that sounds like an absolutely phenomenal campaign. Well, you know, we haven't actually fully acknowledged all the people who are watching today, and some really brilliant questions that are coming forward. So earlier in the conversation, we were talking about some of the wonderful exhibits that we've seen and places that we've gone to, and so on. Has anyone on this chat been to Baikonur? That comes from Tatiana.
Oh,
yeah, I've been a couple of times. Mark, you've been a few times.
I haven't actually.
Oh, haven't
no,
you?
Strangely enough, no.
I've been twice. I've been to two launches there. I was at Sunita Williams, one of her second launch. I was there, and I was there for Tim Peake's launch. I was there with Tim for his launch. So yeah, it's an amazing place. I absolutely love it there. It's it's the most bonkers place you can possibly imagine, because it is still 1950 something at Baikonur. Nothing has changed. You know, no one's washed a window there for, you know, 70 odd years.
The reason I haven't been is because for everything that we launch, one of my bosses, the directors, they always go to the launch, and then they send me off to do media stuff. I mean, Sue's seen me at ESOC in Darmstadt more than once. So it's been incredibly frustrating, 10 years with the European Space Agency, only getting to one launch in the entire time, because I've always been at ESOC. But the flip side to that is some of my favorite people in the world are at ESOC. If anybody's listening, they are the heart of ESA, amazing people.
What I love about Baikonur, it's really interesting because it's this interesting place just the actual location itself. Here we are in the Kazakh steppe in the middle of nowhere, and this rickety old launch site, and there's camels wandering around, and it's the exact opposite of somewhere, you know, like Florida. But the whole history of space flight started at that point. It's like sort of ground zero. That is where Sputnik was launched from. You know, it's where Gagarin was launched from. It was where Laika the dog, Tereshkova, Helen Sharman, all, you know, the whole history of spaceflight within this point. And I remember actually they let me go underneath into the flame trench underneath. And I remember being in the flame trench and looking up. And it's like all of our dreams and our aspirations of leaving this planet happened here. You know, it's happened elsewhere as well, but this is it's almost has a kind of holy spot. It kind of makes sense that you have the priest there. It's a little bit like being at some sort of Mecca or something, or it does almost have a sort of religious significance being there.
Well, my husband.
I'm envious of that, but the one thing I would be even more envious of is if you got to see the hangar where one of the Burans is.
Yeah, I went in there.
Where the roof fell on it. Yeah,
yeah, I've been
absolutely.
I've been on that Buran. I've sat and I've got some nice pictures of it. But it's you know, the whole, you know, walking around, they've got bits of the kind of N1 moon rocket, which they use as bus shelters. You know, they use it as bits of building, and it's just the most you know, people tend to think of space travel as shiny spacesuits, silver spacesuits, and flashy rockets and Corvettes. You know, Baikonur is the exact opposite of that, and I think that's why I hold it in such high regard. It's going to be a real shame, actually, when Baikonur's not going to exist anymore, which I think will probably be quite soon. All the Americans will be flying on a Falcon 9 now, and goodness knows if Baikonur will still be going in a decade.
It's not quite true. The Americans have bought seats on Soyuz even after the demo flight. No. So it's not a complete handover yet.
But what about when the ISS finishes?
Well, okay. Further out, further out. But
I must tell you about when I was working at the BBC, and I was doing a piece on a launch. I can't remember. It was probably launch of one of the modules for the International Space Station, and I got sent some footage from the cameraman who'd been filming at Baikonur, and it was really, at that point, it was really looking underfunded, and it was quite shocking to see how it just looked like somewhere where you go and do your recycling. You know, it was just like a tip, and everything was all over the place. And then I could see, and he'd done a close-up. It was a brilliant shot. He'd done a close-up of this guy, Russian guy, a couple of them with smoking these like hand-rolled little cigarettes, guys. And then they sort of threw it away, and then the camera shot hand out, and there they were about, I don't know, 50 feet away from the rocket as it was being filled. Like, what?
Yeah.
I can't believe it.
We were filming there, and we were like, well, you know, we wanted to set up a camera shot for the actual liftoff. And we were, you know, it was just a few hours before launch, and we were like, you know, can we put our camera here? And it was like, as long as you don't break rockets, you wherever you want. They have a completely different attitude. You know, if they like you and you get on well with them and you're nice, then it's like, as long as you break nothing, it's fine. Yeah. But we lost the camera. One of our cameras got melted. It was so close to the.
Oh my goodness!
I had an interesting experience. So the last launch I went to was for Chaos, small exoplanet satellite that we launched just before the Christmas time, and that was launched on Soyuz, but from Kourou. European Space Agency's launch site in French Guiana. And so everything, you know, there was a day's delay because there was a computer problem on board. It had to be pulled out, and then they shoved another one in, and we all thought, well, we're going to see this launch, is it going to go? But, you know, Russian technology, whack in a new computer. And then the day after, I think I was staying a bit longer than other people who were going back on the VIP flight. There weren't enough seats on that, so I was going back commercial. And I went to the hotel swimming pool, and a bunch of Russian guys turned up at the swimming pool. And it was a real generational thing, because two of them looked like, well, they looked like they were 65. They were probably 45, but, you know, too much vodka. And definitely, you know, 30 or 40 kilos overweight. And you could sense that they were the heart of that rocket system, that they knew every nut and bolt, and they'd grown up. And they had a young guy with them who was probably, I don't know, mid-30s. And there was that generational thing. You're thinking they're handing over what is effectively hard-won you know, not by manuals. They just know. They just know which rivet to knock with a hammer at the right moment to make it go. And I didn't talk to them. I mean, they were there. I was in the swimming pool, and that real sense of human involvement, even in the rocket side. I mean, there the Russians are so deeply engaged.
Oh, it's one. I mean, I was there when they were you know, putting the Soyuz together a few days before the launch. Those were, and actually watching them work and do it is the most beautiful thing. And Soyuz, when you look at it, it's so basic. Those boosters, those side boosters that are on, they're not even bolted on. They just the whole bit of the rocket sits on them like a golf ball on a tee. And when those boosters are pushing up, they're just pushing up against a bracket. And when they run out of steam, they just fall away. It's so elegant. It's so beautiful. It's so simple. It's so Russian.
Yeah.
You know, we wouldn't design anything like that anymore. That was designed in the 1950s. It's the same rocket as the R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile. It's the same thing. You're absolutely right. That sense of tradition. And at Baikonur, the whole town, everyone is involved in it in some way. You know, we got a lift from the airport with a guy, you know, and he was staying in the same hotel, who turned out to be the guy whose job it was also to drive the diesel engine from the assembly hangar to the launch pad. Everyone knows each other. There is a beautiful kind of family sense and a great sense of pride. You know, I love it there. I hope many launches there happen, because it's a wonderful historical place to visit.
That's on my list of places to go, actually, because my husband, Richard Hollingham, and he was there for the very first launch of the first part of the International Space Station, and he came back raving about it, much like you, Dallas, actually was just saying. And he's been there several times since, and he said they were on the mound. They were really quite close to the launch.
Yep,
you know, they weren't at all. And he said, what are we on? What? Because he said, this is good, we're on a hill. And they said, oh, it's a missile silo.
Yeah.
So they were just standing on top. And you know, it wasn't like French Guiana, where you have to be, you know, so far away, and you have, like you say, health and safety is a sort of a more relaxed concept in terms of where you can go.
That mound is really interesting, because when you're standing on that mound, just behind you and to the left is an old football pitch where everyone used to play football. Look at bits of metal from bits of rocket and bits of stuff lying around. And it's just a simple piece of barbed wire that stops you. I mean, you're less than a kilometer away. I mean, it's right there. Right. It's like, oh my God. I mean, Soyuz is quite small, but it's incredible how close you can get.
So for the Chaos launch, we got some video footage from Arianespace afterwards, and I put these into my presentations to, you know, just to show the people. And it was some lovely footage just right from the pad, looking at the Soyuz going up right from underneath. You know, lots of crap falling off the rocket and so on. But the sound was appalling, because the sound was recorded from like 5 kilometers away. That particular piece didn't have a microphone. So I thought, I've got to do better than that. And I went looking on the internet, and there's somebody who is standing next to a Soyuz launch, and you can see it's handheld. They've got their phone out and they're filming it. And if you look at what they're next to, what structure they're actually on, and you can look on Google Earth and see how far they're 147 meters away.
Yeah,
from the launch.
I tell you what,
and they're just taking a handheld mobile phone picture. The sound is brilliant. I'll
tell you what I've got for you, Mark, and anyone else who wants it. I've got when we were filming Tim Peake's launch, our BBC crew that we were with, we had the sound guy really loves this sound and his mics, and we got a fantastic, just a pure sound recording from about 50 feet, and it's beautifully recorded as well. It's like, it doesn't peak too much. And what I do sometimes, on special occasions, I'll put it on my big hi-fi and turn it up, and it's like the room rumbles. It's great. That's the thing when you're at a launch. You know, it's not even so much the visuals. The visuals are great. It's that sound. You feel it. Yeah.
Well, the amazing thing is that because Soyuz has been exactly the same for any number of years, you can transpose the launch sounds. They're identical, because everything happens in exactly the same way. Yeah. And I timed everything. I mean, I did have the crappy launch sound from kilometers away, and everything lined up to the 10th of a second. It was amazing.
My favorite Soyuz story, just very quickly, because downrange of Baikonur, once it goes into its sort of flight trajectory and those boosters fall off, they fall back down to onto the Kazakh steppe. And I don't know if it still happens anymore, but it used to be that local farmers would all rush out and grab the metal and use the metal for animal shelters and to sell. But there was one particular, I think it was like a helium tank, or one particular tank that was exactly the right size as a cooking pot. And it got used by farmers to make local stews. It was a very specific bit of that booster that was sort of recycled by the locals. I love that story. I like the fact that, you know, there are sort of cows and sort of living in these sort of boosters and things. Anyway,
Absolutely fantastic.
I
Well,
love it.
we're coming up toward the end of the time that we have today, but I truly believe that we could go on
We could
for
do.
much longer, because we're just scratching the surface here. But we've had a, oh, please go ahead, Dallas. You were.
I was going to say, Sue, I've just noticed this book, Galina Balashkova, which will change your life. I mean, it's beautiful. No, you don't have to write it down, because I've got 2 copies and one of them hasn't been opened and one of them is for you. And I've just forgot. I got it ages ago for you and I forgot to give it to you. And I've just seen it. So it's good that I've bumped into you today. So I will get that to you somehow.
Did you? I didn't bring it to the room, even though thinking about this in advance, I should have done. But a few weeks ago, we exchanged stuff on Twitter. There's a brilliant new book from Phaidon Press, I think, which is all of the artwork from the Soviet space program.
Yes.
Lots of paintings, magazine covers, and so on, which is just new a few weeks ago, and I've been looking through it. It's marvelous stuff.
But just look at the skill, the kind of draftsmanship. I just love the figures she's done. You know, she designed all the interiors of Salyut, Soyuz, Mir, everything. And, you know, talk about sort of forgotten heroes of the space, of space stories. She is like, you know what I really want to do is get her an exhibition up, because her art is just incredible. And it has such a special place.
Was some of it I think some of it was in the Mars show that the Design Museum put together.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I know they've done it. I mean, in fact, this book actually comes from an exhibition. I think it was in Germany a few years ago. But I don't even know. I mean, I love this picture from the Mir space station. It's like designing the little sleep capsules, which is so lovely. Anyway, blah blah. I just like finding all this kind of stuff. It's makes me very happy. Sorry, carry on. I'm just whittling on.
No. It's absolutely brilliant, and it feels like we need to do a sequel to this.
Oh, look, she did.
Dallas in his book. Me with my Lego. It's like Nerds United. Isn't
Yeah,
it?
look,
Absolutely brilliant. Indeed, we need a handshake.
She designed the Apollo Soyuz logo, which is the finest of the patches of any space patch. Apollo Soyuz.
That is nice.
Galina did that. She did quite a few of those. Oh, and she did all the Buran artwork as well. Mark, you need to. Oh, look at that! Come on.
Yeah. What do you mean you've only got 2 copies? Where? Just don't send it to her. Don't send it to her. She likes the American program. Send it to me.
Get this book. This book is out of print. This is.
Well, you know what to do with that spare. You know what to do with that spare one, Dallas.
Yeah. I think we're gonna have to do. We'll definitely have to do a Buran special at some point.
Oh, and she did beautiful watercolors. She did as well. She was just. I'm just slightly in love. Sorry.
It's absolutely brilliant. Well, we have a final question, and I think it's incredibly fitting, because we've been talking so much about history and rewriting history, which I guess in some way opens up the door for the prospect of space archaeology as well. I mean, how do we preserve these objects, these artifacts that are probably taken for granted, because it always feels like space exploration is in the future. And so we've actually, I'm sorry, Dallas, I think you had to.
No, I just wanted to, I wrote a little chapter about space archaeology. It's a subject very dear to my heart. So, but carry on. I'm
absolutely fantastic. Well, we've got a really great question from Steve, who's been patiently watching.
Yeah.
Who actually asks, what is your most prized space artifact or possession? I'm going to take a wild guess. I don't know what yours might be, Sue. I mean, I'm imagining one of your top 5 is at least in view with you, Dallas.
Actually, I'm going to show you, even though the study is a complete mess, I'm going to show you what's on the wall. This is, can you see it?
Ooh. Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
It's actually a lunar map. Here we go. It's the NASA Apollo lunar orbit chart for Apollo 13,
Wow.
and it was sent with press kits to journalists at the BBC. It was going to be thrown out. We rescued it, and it's signed by Jim Lovell. So that's probably that, and I've got a press kit of the first launch of Eileen Collins, where she was launched as a shuttle commander, and I've got the press kit, and she signed it for me. So they're two
I shall
of
be
my
back momentarily.
That's
Yeah.
that is awesome. That is
And
that
I've
is
got,
wicked.
I think I've actually. Oh yeah, I've got. Oh yeah, I've got Buzz Aldrin signed one of these books for me as well.
Very nice.
One of them's there. We got lots of, and Gene Cernan signed a couple of them. We got lots of little signed books and stuff, including recently the really lovely Kathy Sullivan with her handprints on Hubble, because she was on the mission that deployed Hubble. So I met her about a month ago. She was fabulous. So yeah, so too many to mention.
Absolutely fantastic. Well, that's you certainly trump anything I have. How about yourself, Dallas?
Well, obviously, I've got bits and pieces and various signatures, but the space archaeology is really interesting. I'm particularly interested in the artifacts that are still from Apollo, which are still left on the moon. So obviously bits of spacecraft, but also things like hammers and feathers that Dave Scott did when he was doing his, that's still there. Bits of food, all the bits of spacesuits, most of the space, in fact, all the helmet assemblies, apart from I think one, are still on the surface of the moon. The overboots are
all the cameras as well, all the Hasselblads.
Cameras. NASA did publish a document a few years ago for visiting countries who would be going back to the moon, about how to, things like flags and footprints that are on the moon. Please don't muck these up. These are important, important things. So I'm interested in that whole world. I've got a few bits and pieces. I got the spacesuit, which was made by Ryan Nagata. Ryan is an incredible artist and props maker for film. So he makes film. He did some of the spacesuits for First Man that you will have seen. And actually, this is the very first Apollo A7L suit that he made, which I got from Ryan last year, which I absolutely love. My favorite thing is, meeting some of these people. Really, I was very lucky. Sue, I'm sure you met Al Warden a lot. Al, particularly from Apollo, the command module pilot for Apollo 15, who died sadly last year, became a very close friend of mine, actually, as he did a lot of people in the UK. He was a great friend of this country, and we became good mates. And I'm really sad that he's no longer with us anymore. And when I think about things like that, I think about the people. Really, I think about particularly Al, who became a good friend. I met Buzz Aldrin, like you, Sue, and I met Gene Cernan, but Al particularly had become a very special friend. And I'm, we're reaching that point now where Apollo was a long time ago, and there'll be not too distant future where there won't be any of the Apollo astronauts left. And I think that's going to be a very sad.
But that's why we've come back to the beginning, really, though, haven't we? That's why it's so important to have history and stories, and not just perceived wisdom of history, but to have a more, and that's why I quite like it when astronauts write biographies that are a bit more open and honest, like Mike Mullane's. Funny enough, that happens to be right beside me because Rich has just interviewed Mike Mullane. It's one of really is an absolutely brilliant book because it's so brutally honest and about how it was difficult to cope with the first women on the space shuttle program. And when you have that, when you have a more complete telling of space, whether it's through personal relationships like with Dallas and Al, or mine with Wally, or people who are telling their story and not just telling the official version. Actually being open about, there were grievances. We were pissed off. I think the world is so much richer for it, and in every aspect, but particularly within space. So here's more of that.
I went to Alton Towers with Al Warden. We went to Alton Towers together, and we went on. They've got this virtual reality roller coaster where you put on a virtual reality headset, and so me and Al are on the front row on this roller coaster, and it's a space virtual reality, and you kind of go up, and suddenly you're in space, and it's like I'm like, wow, I'm in space with the command module. This is as close as I'm ever going to get. But having those connections with people who talk, they're not suddenly airbrushed with PR and don't have to tread a kind of party line. They can actually speak. It's a really valuable thing. And lots of
if you've spent time with Buzz, you know how that goes.
Yeah.
Well, exactly. Yes.
So I have one little artifact. I know Alex is maybe another question, but I shared it with some other people last week, and I just thought it's kind of a cool thing. I've got lots of bits and pieces. I work in the space business, got lots of bits and pieces, but I thought I'd bring this one along, which is interesting. The Zoom background will probably make a mess out of it. So this is a piece of Tennessee River rock that's smooth on one side. It's about 300 million years old, and it's broken on the other side. And it's broken because it comes from the crawler way at KSC at Kennedy.
Yeah.
And so Apollo 11 and many shuttles rolled over this piece of quartz.
Nice.
And which one of them broke it? I don't know, because much of the crawler way is actually chipped and broken now because there's been so many rockets going out on the big crawler. So, I mean, it's just weird, the confluence of geology on the Earth, going to the moon to pick up rocks to bring back. I need a little bit of moon rock to put next to it.
I had some. Hang on, I got some moon rock.
There you go. Exactly. We'll do it. We'll do it virtual at least.
Oh, I love it. I love it. That's great.
Sue will recognize this. Sue will recognize this. Do you remember this, Sue? This is some moon dust.
Oh yes, yeah.
I still have it. It's not sadly.
No, it's the simulant moon.
It's the
moon
simulant
dust.
moon dust. But I like playing with it. It makes me really, really happy.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting?
Does it do anything special?
It doesn't do anything special.
It's everywhere.
It's not like slime or something. It's
well, I actually spread it on my spacesuit to kind of dirty it up a bit, make it look a bit kind of. But it's right? Physical objects. Talking about superstitions, but we are so attracted to physical objects. This idea of we'd like to hold things, trinkets, books, signatures, photographs.
I've got this on the study here. This is Star Trek stamps.
Yes.
I've got it's Tatsville here. I've got everything.
Ages ago, before I joined ESA, I was on the advisory committees, and we had a meeting at ESTEC where I work here in the Netherlands now, and we went through the clean rooms, and there was a satellite in the clean rooms, and it was the Integral satellite, which is a gamma ray observatory. It's still in space, launched in 2002, so it's still up there, still working. And we were taken through, and it was right there in our face. And most of Integral, to be honest, I mean, my Integral project scientist friend Eric Kulkers will scream at me. Most of it's made of lead. I mean, it's not exactly, I mean, yes, there's lots of high tech inside, but it's got enormous, great big lead shields around it to stop cosmic rays interfering with the stuff you're actually seeing from distance. So I remember quite distinctly, because I have this real infatuation for touching real spaceflight hardware, actually putting your finger on it. There's something symbolic about that.
Yes.
So I put my hand up to touch the side of the piece of lead on the side of the spacecraft. And it wasn't a technician that stopped me. It was one of the scientists who was on the committee, and she was involved in the mission. And she reached up, and I'll give away the nationality. She said, "You don't touch my satellite. You touch your own satellite." So yeah, I never touched Integral, I'm afraid, but I was never really going to. But
there's a little thing I found just talking about moon dust. The Apollo, every country was given a little piece of Apollo rock from Apollo 11 and Apollo 17. All the countries of the United Nations, I think, were given a little bit of rock. The Irish one went missing, and apparently, and I'm quoting myself here. In the suburbs of Dublin is an old landfill site containing some 4 million tons of waste. And back in 1977, the Dunsink Observatory across the road caught fire, and the remains were all thrown into this landfill site. And apparently, the Apollo moon rock that was given to Ireland is in that landfill site across the road from the Dunsink Observatory. So there you go. Somebody could do a bit of space archaeology and dig within that 4 million tons of debris and see if they can find it.
I think that's definitely a subject for a future episode of Uplink, without question. But
sorry, carry on. I could go on.
You'll have to get Alice Gorman on because she's
Alice Gorman's terrific.
Yeah, Alice is great. She's the expert. She's brilliant. I know Alice. She's wonderful.
Indeed. Well, I have to say, Dallas and Sue, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on Uplink. Not the first time, certainly not the last time that we'll see you through our doors, virtually or otherwise, I hope. Thank you so much for making the time and so much stimulating discussion. I wish we had more time, but thank you on behalf of everyone who's been watching and everyone at Space Rocks as well.
We have time for one more thing, of course.
Okay, all right.
And that is the official.
We've been talking about traditions here. Hopefully,
the official
Do we
Space
have
Rocks.
to pee on something?
No, you have to do the official Space Rocks hand signal. You
I
can
can't
go, you know, come on, Dallas. You can.
right hand
the
Vulcan, left hand.
Vulcan salute and rocks, Space Rocks. There you go.
There we go. Ah.
Oh dear, we found something Dallas can't do. Oh, no.
Not yet. 3 to 4 hours, 6 months, you'll be fine. All right. Thank you so much.
Sue, drop me your address and I'll post the book.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, Dallas. Thanks, Sue. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.